Hello everyone, welcome to Sector Analysis. Today's topic is, are UK supermarkets overpriced? I'm going to be looking at how much do mainstream supermarkets mark up their products, is premium supermarket markup due to quality or branding, and are discount supermarkets lower quality or are they just more efficient? Starting off with the stores themselves, I'm going to be considering Aldi a discount, Tesco and Sainsbury's mainstream, and Waitrose a premium one. So starting off with the mainstream ones, so Tesco and Sainsbury's being the two biggest ones in the UK, they seem to have a gross margin of 6 to 7%. So gross profit is revenue minus cost of goods sold. Gross margin, so the reason we care about it is because that is the value that the customer gets. 6 to 7%, keep in mind, is very low. It does not leave a lot of room for error, so these are generally quite tight run operations. Moving on into the premium supermarkets, we look at M&S and Waitrose, both of them boasting a gross margin of around 30 to 33%. That is a stark difference to what we saw over here on the mainstream 6 to 7. However, looking at operating margin, we actually see a similar number to that of the mainstream ones, being somewhere between 2 to 4%. So looking at it a bit more in depth, what seems to be the reason for that is a difference in accounting. So M&S and Waitrose seem to put stuff like employee costs and occupancy costs into operating expenses, whereas Sainsbury's and Tesco mostly put these under cost of goods sold. Therefore, M&S and Waitrose only considers product acquisition as cost of goods sold, which is the traditional sense of cost of goods sold, whereas Sainsbury considers all store operating costs as cost of goods sold, so that being the lease for the store or the employees working at that store. Looking into some of the operating expenses a bit more in depth, we can see stuff like IT costs and marketing costs. They probably are higher than Sainsbury's total 1.3 billion administrative expenses, but due to there being a difference in accounting, I'd be very reluctant to accuse something going on here. So up next, looking at discount supermarkets, I'm going to be having a look at Aldi. So Aldi has a gross margin of 5%, so even lower than the mainstream supermarkets. And then an earnings before tax margin of 2.2%. So why am I focusing in on this earnings before tax? So over here, I've made a table showing the operating expense plus interest of each of Aldi, Tesco, and Sainsbury's. It made sense that Tesco is lower on the operating expenses than Sainsbury's, probably due to, let's say, economies of scale. However, Aldi, it does not make sense that Aldi outperforms both Tesco and Sainsbury's, given that it has lower revenue than the two of them. So the way they're actually able to do it is due to a slight difference in approach. So Aldi owns about 73% of assets, so that being usually the stores, so land and buildings, as opposed to Sainsbury's owning only 58% and Tesco owning only 66%. These numbers here seem to follow quite well the story over here. And actually that is mostly because the interest costs of leased assets show up as an interest expense. So that is how Aldi is able to push its gross margin even lower than Tesco and Sainsbury's, and then still come out with earnings, so a net income that is actually higher than Sainsbury's, even though having gross margin 2% lower than it. Finally, I'm going to be looking at one more example, and that is Iceland. And I've called it frozen supermarket financials, mostly because Iceland business model focuses mainly on frozen food. So how is it able to use that to actually underprice the other mainstream supermarkets? So looking at the gross margin, we see a gross margin of 4.4%, that being the lowest out of every single retailer that we've seen up until this point. So how is it able to use the fact that it sells mostly frozen food to its advantage? Unsold food contributes to cost of goods sold, but does not generate revenue. The industry average for food waste is somewhere around 2%, meaning that the cost of goods sold is 2% higher because of food that does not get sold. In a world where gross margins are 5 to 6%, that actually makes a big difference. And looking at Iceland, its percentage of food waste is only 0.5%, much lower than the industry average. Another way we can look into this is seeing redistribution rates. So most supermarkets, whenever food is about to expire, instead of throwing it away, they would usually give it to some kind of charity. Here we see Iceland being the worst performer. That is mostly because they don't have to donate anything, because all their food is frozen and generally does not expire. Concluding today's topic, premium supermarkets seem to have a higher gross margins, mostly due to a difference in accounting. Discount retailers like Aldi can only lower prices due to a large percentage of store ownership and low debt. Discount retailers like Iceland can only offer lower prices due to the frozen food business model. And finally, overall industry low margins are bad for investors, but great for consumers. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed today's sector analysis. Hope to see you around.